It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the Heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Well, good morning. Hello. Hi. How are you? Welcome back into another podcast by George. We've got about 25 minutes or so this morning. We want to revisit the situation with the UAW Deere strike settlement because that's huge news. As I said the last time that we had our guest on, this is something they're going to be talking about, not just in labor circles, but in the history books for decades. And it was right in our backyard here, right in the Heartland. And joining us on the podcast by George live line this morning is Dr. Peter Orazem. He's a professor of economics at Iowa State University. His fields of interest include labor economics, human capital, and agricultural economics. Peter joined Iowa State University as an assistant professor way back in 1982. Man, that's when I was on the air. And he received university professorships in 2003. He has a PhD from Yale and is author of the book Child Labor and Education in Latin America, an Economic Perspective. So let's get him in here because his time is limited this morning. He's a working man. He's teaching this morning. So let's get him on the podcast here and say good morning and welcome back into the PBG, Dr. Orazem.
Well, good morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming in. And I wanted to get to this straight off. I wanted to make sure that we brought this up and talked about this at the beginning, this tragic story connected to the strike. Following a John Deere contract ratification, the Des Moines UAW bargaining chair dies of COVID-19. This is an article out of the Des Moines Register. The day after United Auto Worker members ratified their new contract with Deere and Company, the head negotiator for the Des Moines local died of COVID-19. UAW Local 450, which represents workers at Deere's Ankeny plant, announced in a Facebook post that bargaining committee chair Curtis Templeman had died Thursday afternoon. The local posted earlier in the day that Templeton had been intubated at an Iowa City hospital. Quote, "He fought through what he thought was the sniffles to finish these negotiations," the union posted online. When it was done, he went on to seek medical treatment and was diagnosed with COVID. I don't know that I've seen a more selfless act. He pushed through to make sure that he served the brothers and sisters that elected him. Okay, so, I mean, that is really poignant, but it's, we had some foreshadowing on the show, and I've got to show this. Now, I'm going to go, this is a clip from the earlier show that I had Dr. Orazem on, and we were talking about exactly that. Watch this. One thing that's just kind of taken for granted that a lot of people don't talk about very much is this bargaining table. Can you enlighten us? What is that all about, really? Are they in a conference room, around a table, or is this done by proxy somehow?
Well, I don't know how they're handling the negotiations are not public. And so how they're handling it, whether they're doing it by Zoom or around a table, in this pandemic environment, I do not know, but I suspect that they're hashing things out face to face.
I mean, I'm still just blown away looking at that, Dr. Orazem. And I guess other than being ironic and foreshadow and all of that, I would say that when it comes to these negotiations and these strikes and these subsequent stuff, this is serious business. I mean, it's deadly serious. It claimed this man's life. And there was another death also during this strike out in the Quad City. Somebody got hit by a car out there near a picket line and died. So, I mean, this couldn't be more important.
Well, no, I mean, it's very serious to try to reach these settlements. And it's, of course, unfortunate that these two events happened. I don't know that either of them, accidents happen and illnesses happen, and it's of course our hearts go out to the families and so on for the loss. But that the UAW negotiator was working as hard as he could to try to get this deal done. So sometimes those things come back to haunt you.
Well, his name was Curtis Templeman, so I hope folks remember that name. I want to jump into this here again because our time is limited. I want to bring this up on screen, and that's the article that we were just talking about. So this is the UAW statement on the strike after it ended. On behalf of the entire UAW, our thoughts and prayers go out to Curtis Templeman's family and his John Deere Des Moines co-workers. Curtis worked tirelessly on behalf of our members while displaying great character and leadership as he earned the highest respect from the Deere negotiating team. So this is an article that I saw that quoted you recently and gets to kind of the present day here, Doctor. It says Iowa State University economics professor Peter Orazem believes asking and searching for higher wages and better benefits is something that is becoming more prominent. We know that compensation terms are rising in non-union settings as well. People forget that. I mean, they think about the strike if they were close to it, but this is kind of nationwide, and it's union and non-union. Wages are going up. People are changing jobs. Employers are under pressure to provide not only higher salaries, but better benefits. And there is inflationary pressure going on right now, as I understand it. Maybe you can elaborate on that a little.
Right. I mean, where you see high incidence of strikes in the past has been when the economy is expanding and there's inflationary pressures in the economy, and there's generally upward pressure on wages overall, both from the inflation and from strong labor demand. And those situations are certainly with us today, and in a really strange way, because also employment is well below what it was at pre-pandemic levels. And yet, if you look at the number of unfilled vacancies per month, they're as large as the number of total vacancies per month that we had before the pandemic. And so there's very strong labor demand relative to the existing supply. And under those circumstances, there's going to be a lot of upward pressure on wages and compensation. And firms are raising their compensation in the non-union sector as well. And typically there's a premium in the union sector relative to the non-union sector. And so that's going to also be pushing up wages in the union sector. And you would expect that as negotiations continue over the next few years, you're going to see much richer contracts from the perspective of labor than what was true in the past.
We're about the same age. I mean, you got to be about our age to go back and remember the 1970s. But I remember this inflation thing in the 1970s. Honest to God, folks, I wanted to buy a new home back then. The conventional home mortgage rate was 17.5%. Oh my God. I mean, we haven't seen anything like that since. And I always thought that maybe we would never see anything like that before. And I know you're watching this very closely. What's your sense right now? Or, you hear runaway inflation. Now, this isn't runaway inflation, but is it getting close?
Not yet. If you look at the 1970s, they would have been happy to have a 5 or 6% inflation rate. But there are warning signs, and you can see that the Federal Reserve chair in comments made yesterday is now basically alerting the markets that the Fed is going to have to start putting the brakes on sort of slack monetary policy. And so you're going to have upward pressure on interest rates in order to try to stem some of the upward pressure on price increases. And it's hard for me to believe that that's going to be that costly in a situation where we have 4 million unfilled vacancies per month. But you would expect it to have some adverse effect on the expansion in terms of the number of job openings that we get per month going forward.
Well, I want to keep moving along here, and we're jumping around a little bit. I apologize for that. This Deere thing is integral to what we're talking about. Inflation is the elephant in the room that everybody's looking at. I wanted to bring this article up on screen here. Now, this is from Laura Bellin, and she's a frequent guest on Podcast by George. Love Laura Bellin, as everybody knows, and people that watch my show really like her. And she authors Bleeding Heartland, and this is from her blog. And she says, John Deere could have offered workers more. 1 week after Oh, where did we go here? Let me get back here. Only a week after United Auto Workers members ratified a new 6-year contract with John Deere, the company announced record profits of $5.96 billion during the fiscal year that ended on November 1st. Okay, I wanted to ask you about that, Dr. Orazem, because that earnings report and that projection, they're talking about maybe $7 billion next year. That came out right after the strike was settled. Was that coincidental, or do you think that was a part of the negotiations here, that Deere knew that this was coming out? They didn't suffer financially because of the strike at all, it looks like, and it's not going to harm them short or long term, it looks like.
Well, remember, I mean, the earnings statement reflects conditions before the new contract was ratified and put into effect. And so, you know, what happens going forward is going to depend on other factors. But all the things that have led to John Deere doing relatively well in the last year or so, certainly since the start of the pandemic, strong demand for agricultural commodities, improvements in the climate for lumber for that division, and of course construction with the passage of the infrastructure bill. All of those things are going to bode well for sales for John Deere across their divisions, and you would expect that to be the same going forward. But it's clear that the strike was a concern to investors because the stock price went down every time they failed to ratify a contract, and the stock price went up when the contract was ultimately ratified. And I think that when you see that, you know that what really was of concern was a protracted strike that would have been extremely damaging to John Deere's profit picture.
Well, Laura goes on in this article, and she points out that this the third offer, whatever that they settled on, wasn't that much different than the second. Yet there was a huge difference in the vote. And she mentions the fact that the strike benefits are like $275 a week for the strikers, and maybe that started to weigh on their mind a little bit, particularly as we approach wintertime and the holiday season and all that. What do you think was the genesis? What do you think caused such an overwhelming vote in support of this third offer that didn't differ that much from the second?
Well, I think the union actually put out statements to their rank and file saying that they thought that this was about as good a deal as they were going to make. And they also sort of raised the specter of potential use of substitute labor or shifting production to other facilities, and maybe they made some of the workers a little bit nervous. But I mean, I'm not in a position to judge how much John Deere would have been able to come across, and I suspect that the journalist is in no better position than I am to make that assessment. But you do have to weigh how much better are you going to do from a more protracted strike. And I think that both on management and labor side, they know that these are cyclical industries, and they have to be able to make money when the demand is strong, because you're just as likely to have recessionary situations in these durable goods manufacturing businesses. And everybody remembers that John Deere was laying people off 2 years ago. And so both labor and management know that you've got to make hay when the sun shines in this business. And so neither side would have wanted a protracted strike. On the other hand, I think that you're going to see a lot of other businesses that are going to look at the John Deere contract, and that's going to be setting the stage then for those negotiations as well. And so if the John Deere contract is considered relatively more favorable toward labor, that is going to be setting the stage for future negotiations in other manufacturing businesses, certainly in durable goods manufacturing.
And there's more to these contracts, as you pointed out in the last show that we did together about, it's not just salaries, it's just not benefits. Term of the contract comes into play here. And I just read the fact, I think this is a 6-year agreement. Did the term of the contract come into play?
Well, it did, and they have a cost of living adjustment that they did not have in their previous contract. And clearly that is reflecting the uncertainty about what's going to be happening in terms of the future value of the dollar. John Deere must have been very interested in locking in a contract over an extended period, because in inflationary environments, sometimes you would end up with much shorter contracts because of uncertainty about what the value of a particular promise is going to be. So by putting in the cost of living adjustments, you're protecting the workers from locking in a future wage increase that's going to turn out not to be as favorable if inflation eats into that wage adjustment.
Well, we've got about 5 more minutes to share with the good doctor here before he heads off to the classroom. I wanted to bring this up because this is an important clip, and I've had this on a couple of times before, but you couldn't get the union to comment very much. You couldn't get the management of the union to talk at all, but I was able to get one union member to talk outside of Local 450, and it kind of shows you how angry the workers were, and it's going to lead to my next question, but let's watch this.
It pissed us off. 100%. You called me essential. We came to work every single day, and we continue to make you millions, not millions, billions of dollars. And you say you want to give us 5 to 6% up front. It's a slap in the face.
So that was after the first offer when they decided to go on strike. Now, the workers did a lot better. They got about double of, I think, what they were originally offered there. But I was surprised you have to look for it. But if you research, you'll find that not all the workers were happy with this agreement. There's always kind of buyers and sellers remorse with this type of thing. There are a lot of UAW workers out there that are still unhappy with this, and they're looking at, again, this earnings statement that we talked about earlier, and the billions of dollars that John Deere is making, and they think that their leadership in the UAW could have done better and should have done better, but didn't. Now, is that always going to be a part of this after a settlement is reached, that you're going to have this buyers and sellers remorse?
Well, I mean, you didn't have a unanimous vote in favor. I think that particularly in the Waterloo workplace, there were disagreements not just between labor and management, but between labor and the UAW. And I think that colors some of what was going on in this requirement. But remember, Sam Gompers, I think it was, is the one who said there's no greater crime that a firm can do against labor than to fail to make a profit. If you want to know when it is that workers are doing poorly, it's when you have an unprofitable firm. And so cheering for John Deere to not do well is not in the interests of labor in any way, shape, or form. And so the better John Deere does, the better the workers do. And clearly the negotiated settlement, much better than the original settlement or the original offer, reflects the fact that John Deere has done relatively well.
Well, I know you follow labor very closely in the press. I talked a little bit earlier about how this, earnings report affected the negotiations, perhaps, for Deere. They knew that it was coming out. They knew that this might further inflame their workers, whether or not that's true or not. But what about labor itself now? A lot of people were on the left were hoping that this was going to, the Deere strike, that is, was going to really get the ball rolling, that there were going to be other strikes at major corporations that are unionized. I think Kellogg's is still on strike. Is this provide some impetus that it's just kind of where it's at?
Well, we've had, by the end of October, 12 strikes of over 1,000 workers or more during the course of the year. It's not like there's a large number of strikes. And to some extent, I think that negotiations or the business of negotiations between unions and management have improved over time. And so they know what the circumstances are, and they try to come up with negotiations that are going to be fair. And so strikes have become less common in part because management isn't forcing strikes by, say, forcing unions to show their hand and their power. I think it's more useful to look at, are we going to see more favorable contracts in terms of the terms and conditions of employment and going forward? And I think we will, but they may not require a strike. It may just be that management realizes that the labor is in a better bargaining position. They'll come across with better terms, better offers.
Well, he's out of time, and I want to be respectful of that. We got to let him go. Doctor, I want you to close here. Just either for watching inflation or watching the labor situation around the country, how do you advise people? What do you tell people to keep an eye on right now?
Well, inflation, it's clear that there's inflationary pressures in the economy, and those are now getting built into wage increases. And in fact, in the last quarter, wages rose more slowly than inflation. So the purchasing power of wages actually went down, and that's not going to continue in this market. So I think we're beginning to see the building up of inflationary pressures in terms of wage increases. And that's what got us into the stagflation of the 70s. And I do think that it's going to be really interesting to see how the Federal Reserve System tries to fight that rising inflationary pressure, because this is a very different source of inflation than just, say, having loose money supply. The Fed can't do much about inflation that's related to the lack of the supply of goods and services because of too few workers and supply chain problems. And so we may be in for a little bit of a rough go in terms of inflation, persistent inflation that we just haven't had in the last 20 to 25 years in the United States.
Well, I'm prepared for a little bit of a rough go. I don't want to see 17.5% conventional home mortgage rates again. My God, that is something that affected me that I'll never forget.
Houses at about the same time. Our first house was a double-digit interest rate as well.
God, we got to let him go. Folks, that's Dr. Peter Orazem, professor of economics at Iowa State University. Dr. Orazem, thanks again for coming on another podcast by George Liveline.
Well, thanks so much for thinking of me. It's much an honor. Thank you.
And folks, if you like podcasts by George, I just, as always, want to encourage folks to subscribe on YouTube, which is where we are today with the live line, and ring the notification bell. A lot of times they're shorter in duration like this. I mean, you don't have to spend all day watching this like you do with some podcasts. Sometimes they're longer form. But if you appreciate this kind of insight and this kind of expert analysis, we have it on the show frequently. Please follow us on Facebook, like us there. You can subscribe to us on iTunes, get us on Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, Amazon Music, all kinds of places. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up for now. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.